Military history. That's Saturday at 11:30 p.m. Eastern. Next Sunday at noon, Abolition Democracy, Angela Davis on America's treatment of political prisoners. And at 10 p.m. Eastern, Take It Back, Paul Begala and James Carville on their new primer for Democrats.
In The Big Empty, 82-year-old Norman Mailer answers questions from his 27-year-old son, John Buffalo Mailer. Next weekend on Book TV, you can see the Mailers as they address topics ranging from President Bush, the Iraq War, and corporate culture to boxing, cards, and women. That's Saturday at 10 p.m. Eastern. In Sucker Punch, Jack Cashill makes the claim that Muhammad Ali exaggerated parts of his biography to create a grievance narrative. At this talk from the Kansas City Public Library, Mr. Cashill also examines the impact Ali's relationship with Islam had on the civil rights movement. This is an hour.
I always do really brief introductions for the guests because we like to spend as much time as possible with them, and that's certainly true this evening. So tonight our guest is Jack Cashill, the author of Hoodwinked, for his new book, Sucker Punch. And so I hope that you will join me in a warm welcome for Mr. Jack Cashill.
Thank you all for coming down to this lovely building, and thanks Vivian and Rainy Day Books for the actually really extraordinary service they do. I don't think anyone in this area does more for a local culture than Rainy Day Books, and it's good to see them keeping the whole enterprise of reading alive and well, especially through small bookstores. I want to talk tonight essentially about boxing, at least on the surface, but I'm really going to be talking about a deeper subject, and that is how we choose our heroes and how those heroes are presented to us, and also finally how that presentation changed dramatically about 40 years ago and blindsided all of us, including the subject of my book tonight, Muhammad Ali. He is not so much the author of the sucker punch in question as the victim, as many of us are, and I think and finally the nation is. I was first introduced in a serious way to heavyweight boxing at the premiere of On the Waterfront. I was 6 years old. This is the film premiere of On the Waterfront, the movie. That wasn't the Hollywood premiere exactly, and it wasn't the New York premiere exactly, and it wasn't even the Newark, New Jersey premiere exactly. What it exactly was my neighborhood Newark, New Jersey premiere of On the Waterfront. And given the humbleness of this premiere at the Tivoli Theater on Orange Street, we didn't get Marlon Brando, and we didn't get Carl Malden, and we didn't even get Eva Marie Saint or Rod Steiger, both of whom are from Newark, but we got someone actually who was much better. And that was, of course, as you all know, Toni Galento. That is two-ton Toni Galento, just to clarify, in case you don't know who Toni Galento is. He was the first real celebrity I had ever met, and it was my most exciting celebrity encounter until last year when I sat at a table next to Brad Pitt in a Santa Monica restaurant. So it was just an incredibly exciting night. Everyone in my neighborhood was there. And Two-Ton Tony introduced the film. And in the movie, he plays a Union goon, which, if you know anything about Two-Ton Tony, was not much of a stretch. It was sort of a natural role. What made it just a little bit distracting was that every time he came on the screen, which wasn't often, everyone in the theater would go, "Hey, Tony!" You know, so it just went on 6, 10, 12 times. But how could you not like a guy like Two-Ton Toni Galento, especially when he came out of your own neighborhood? Here's what he did in his career. First of all, he knocked down, in a heavyweight championship fight, Joe Louis, which is not an estimable thing. He also fought, to us even more impressively, a bear, a kangaroo, and an octopus. Now, for the record, here's what happened. He beat the bear, he beat the kangaroo, he lost a split decision to the octopus because he fled the tank when it squirted its inkjets at him. This is a true story. And once Joe Louis got up off the canvas, dazed, really surprised that Two-Ton Tony put him there, he, of course, whooped Two-Ton Tony's butt. But not many guys in my neighborhood had knocked Joe Louis down, so that was quite a feat in and of itself. Now, the question is then, I went back and started looking, and I said to myself, how many books has Two-Ton Toni been the subject of? And I thought this would be an interesting exercise, and just to see what how famous people are and how fame works. Well, it turns out that Two-Ton Toni is the subject of one book, and it was called Galento the Great. It was written in 1939, and it was 119 pages. Now, it's not as though he were actually slighted, because in fact, other boxers are typically not any more written about than Two-Ton Toni Galento. For instance, Joe Frazier. Do you know how many books are written about Joe Frazier that he didn't write himself, the boxer? One. And it's called the Joe Frazier, The Unknown Story, understandably. You know how many books are written about George Foreman that aren't cookbooks? One, right? Whoa. We planned that. That was part of the excitement here. Okay. Yes, honestly. Now, the question then becomes is how many books were written about Muhammad Ali? Anyone want to take a guess? 108. And I stopped counting. I didn't count books like The Fight by Norman Mailer or On Boxing by Joyce Carol Oates or even The Ghost of Manila by Mark Cram, because they didn't feature solely Muhammad Ali. That was 108 books that I counted on Amazon about Muhammad Ali. At least 15 or 20 of these are children's books or books for adolescents. I just brought a couple of them along here. And the theme of these books is generally the same, and that is, let me just read just from the back. This is a book for 12 years of olds and up, 12 years of age and up. It says, from his childhood in the segregated South to his current fight with Parkinson's disease, Ali never backed down. He was banned from boxing during his prime because he refused to fight in Vietnam. He became a symbol of the anti-war movement and a defender of civil rights. The greatest, he was called. He was a boxer of undeniable talent and courage. He took the world by storm. Only Ali could float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. And this is essentially the message that is being sold and given to children throughout the world. Now, if you're a fan of Ali, you may not like a large part of what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, because I'm going to talk about the third of his life that he himself is less proud of. I'm also going to talk about the third of his life, which he's more justifiably proud of, and the first third of his life, which is admirable in many ways. But the middle third was not. That notwithstanding, the great majority of books about Ali, I would say 105 out of the 108, just by my own estimation, celebrate the middle third of his life. And when you look at the way that life is celebrated, for instance, his authoritative biographer, Thomas Hauser, who wrote Muhammad Ali, Life and Times, the Bible of the Ali Library. Hauser interviewed nearly 200 people, and it's really the without which not of studying Ali's life. He says of Ali, he says, to some, Ali was the greatest hero to come out of the Vietnam War. And that some includes Thomas Hauser. That some includes virtually everyone else who wrote about Muhammad Ali. The Yale-educated scholar Thomas Hayatollah, when he's talking about the years 1960 to 1975, he said the period that damaged virtually all reputations in America, Ali was one of the few people to come out of that era with his reputation enhanced. And he was actually fairly accurate about that. He did. The question I'm going to ask is how and why. The question I'm going to ask tonight is how we choose our heroes and why we chose them. Now, what makes Ali's life most interesting, I think, is this, is that he had a different take than his biographers did on that very period of his life. Let me just read you some quotes about how he felt about that period that he went through, roughly the period that he was in the Nation of Islam, from essentially 1964 when he joined officially to 1975, certainly, when Elijah Muhammad died. That was his mentor, his guru. I should say this, by the way, just to clarify it. There is a big difference between the Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad and Islam. It is something like the difference between, say, the Ku Klux Klan and Christianity. I mean, the one uses the symbols, but appropriates them in odd, different directions. The Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad, for instance, didn't believe in an afterlife. It was more of a social organization, cultural organization, than a religion. For the record, the Nation of Islam fell dormant for about 3 years after Elijah Muhammad died, and Farrakhan picked it up. I don't know what it's like today or how it compares to what was under Elijah Muhammad, but for the record, when I talk about Nation of Islam, I'm talking about Elijah Muhammad's branch thereof. Here's how Ali himself talks about his glory years. He traces his hour of enlightenment to, quote, around 1983. That's when he began to see the light in his own perspective. It was only then, he said, that he became a, quote, true believer. I thought I was a true believer, but I wasn't. I fit my religion to do what I wanted. I did things that were wrong and chased women all the time. I conquered the world, and it didn't bring me true happiness. The only true satisfaction comes from honoring and worshiping God. This is the conclusion he came to in about 1983. And since then, he's lived his life, I'd say, according to that, fairly nobly. I mean, he's borne his cross, if I could use that word, pretty gracefully. Now, to show you what a great transition he made in 1983, in 1984, he shows up publicly at, of all places, and this is something that his mythologizers have totally suppressed, the Republican National Convention, as a Ronald Reagan supporter. In 1988, he supported George H.W. Bush, and he was a big fan of Arlen Specter. Now, this is for the mythologizers of Muhammad Ali is fairly embarrassing, but it's testament to how dramatic a transition he made in his life. It was real. This is a guy who a few years earlier I'll tell you what he was saying. This is a stunning admission. It should inform everything that's been written about Muhammad Ali, but it hasn't. The people who continue to write about Muhammad Ali act as though he did not have his own road to Damascus moment. It's as if you were writing about St. Paul and all you talked about was his Christian bashing, and you celebrated it. Come to think of it, Ali did his fair share of that, but they continue to celebrate it. It's as if you were writing about St. Augustine. I mean, the Confessions of St. Augustine. If anyone's read that, I mean, what makes the book interesting is how he lived his life before he had his moment. But the book doesn't celebrate his carousing and his whoring and his running around. The authors of Ali books continue to do that, as though he never had a moment of coming to Allah. A more likely analysis is, and a more complex analysis is Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X, and I'm going to have to tell you a little bit of the history of Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, because it actually shapes Ali's life. It shapes the whole history of racial relations in America. Malcolm X was a member of the Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad. He was, in a sense, guided by the same man who would guide Muhammad Ali. Malcolm X was a more formidable character than Ali. He was older, wiser, smarter, and more self-determined. However, here's what he says about his 12 years under Elijah Muhammad. And these 12 years didn't end until essentially late 1963 or early 1964, a year before he died. He says, I was a zombie then. Like all Muslims, I was hypnotized, pointed in a certain direction, and told to march. Well, I guess a man's entitled to make a fool of himself if he's ready to pay the cost. It cost me 12 years. This is Malcolm X on Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam and his 12 years there. What we celebrate about Malcolm X's life is really the last year of his life, when he broke from the Nation of Islam, when he began to see that white people weren't blue-eyed devils necessarily, when he stopped waiting for the big-headed Yaqub and the spaceship circling Earth to come down and destroy the white race, when he finally realized in the last weeks and months of his life, as he told his biographer, Alex Haley, that brotherhood is the only answer. And this is a conclusion he didn't come to the last year of his life. His life is worth studying and worth honoring because of that last year, not because of the 12 years when he was a zombie. It wouldn't make sense. However, in Ali's case, we celebrate the zombie period. It's just one of those things. Now, Malcolm X isn't the only one who gives a witness to this period of Ali's life. What I did in doing the book, I realized that sports writers in general tend to write about their own experiences, what they've seen and heard. And there's a whole library of books about Ali that go unread or unsolicited or uncommented on. For instance, virtually every major fighter in the late 20th century wrote an autobiography. A lot of them had contact with Ali. Some of these books are incredibly illuminating, most notably Archie Moore's, Sugar Ray Robinson's, Floyd Patterson's, Larry Holmes, George Foreman. They all had contact, and they all shed a lot of light on it. One woman who sheds an awful lot of light on Ali's period, his zombie period, was his first wife, Sonia, whom he married in 1964. When they divorced, she said she wanted a man who was, quote, who would be his own master. And from her perspective, that was not the young Muhammad Ali. As she would tell Jack Olson at Sports Illustrated, they've stolen my man's mind. This is the critical period of his life. They've stolen my man's mind. Now, Howard Cashill, who plays a really interesting role and a critical role in Ali's eventual acceptance, and he's also constantly speaking out of both sides of his mouth, so it's hard to figure out exactly what he's saying. But in this case, on the question of the draft, Cashill writes, Ali bent neither to pressure nor friendly overture. But then, one page later, he's quoted as saying, he quotes Ali as saying, "Can't talk to you no more, not without Elijah's permission." And then Cashill comments, "This was simply further evidence of the degree of control the Muslims exercised over Ali." Now, Ali's no-nonsense aunt, who spoke, unlike Cashill, out of only one side of her mouth, and his aunts are great because they're such straight shooters, she says of her nephew, "He was brainwashed. He's going to mess himself up, so won't nobody go see him." Now, this book isn't, as I said earlier, it's not really about Muhammad Ali. It's about how we have come to choose that period of Ali's life and make it heroic. Now, there is two things that happened. One is general. It happened at that period. One is specific to Ali, that make for the transformation of Ali, the brainwashed, the man who had his mind stolen, into a national hero. The other one is specific to Ali. The general one I describe in the book as what I call the grievance narrative. Now, the grievance narrative essentially developed in America probably in the early part of the 20th century, but only in special cases, like the case of Sacco and Vanzetti come to mind, where these were two guys who were guilty of shooting a payroll clerk in Massachusetts. They were two anarchists. But when they were tried, they realized that their best defense was to throw themselves on the mercy of the court, to let the court know that they were anarchists, that they were being persecuted because they were Italian immigrants and they were anarchists, etc. But that's not the truth. It wasn't the way it was. That remained in the background for about 40 years. It really wasn't until the 1960s that the grievance narrative became normative, became more or less the norm, and it's become more or less since then. Now, in the grievance narrative, what you see is historically you would have a story. A hero would be someone who faced obstacles as a young man or a young woman, overcame those obstacles, and through perseverance and hard work went on to become a hero of some sort by doing good deeds. The grievance narrative had a different take on it. Instead of overcoming obstacles and hardships and injustices, you nursed them like grudges, and they became you, and you sort of soaked them in, and they were who you were. So, and then instead of overcoming them, because there was no overcoming them in a world that was dictated by institutional racism and structural poverty, what you did is you asked for a collective reordering of society. So in other words, there was no individual accomplishment in this world. There was a collective accomplishment done through the nursing, the airing of the grievance. And when you write a grievance narrative, when you write a typical narrative, heroic narrative, what you try to inspire in your audience is a sense of accomplishment and joy and hope. When you write a grievance narrative, what you try to instill is a sense of guilt and anger. And that's the way the grievance narrative works. Now, I'm going to take a quick sip of water here, and then I'm going to talk while I'm drinking this water. I was just watching an Edgar Bergen movie the other night. I was amazed how well he did that. That's the father of Candice Bergen, for those who care. Here's a classic sentence in the way the grievance narrative works. It's from Joyce Carol Oates' book on boxing. Now, Joyce Carol Oates, by the way, is obviously a National Book Award winner, noted author. She's also a heck of a boxing writer. She's no dilettante. She writes extremely well and extremely knowledgeably on the subject of boxing. On the subject of the culture in general, however, she's locked into the grievance narrative. And here's what she says about the very first sentence about Muhammad Ali in her biographical sketch of Ali. Muhammad Ali, and I'm going to invite you to tell me what is the one phrase in here that sticks out, that's beyond the expected. Muhammad Ali, born Cassius Marcellus Clay in Louisville, Kentucky, on January 17, 1942, grandson of a slave, began boxing at the age of 12, and by 18 had fought 108 amateur bouts. Which one phrase in there doesn't seem to belong, that's beyond the obvious? Let me read that again for you. Muhammad Ali, born Cassius Marcellus Clay in Louisville, Kentucky, on January 17, 1942, grandson of a slave, began boxing at the age of 12, and by 18 had fought 108 amateur bouts. Grandson of a slave. I mean, why is that particularly relevant? For instance, and this is the grievance narrative really kicks in the middle of the 60s. In 1961, Jack Newcomb wrote a very smart book about Floyd Patterson, then the reigning heavyweight champion, in which he doesn't mention the fact at all that Floyd Patterson was a descendant of slaves. He doesn't even mention the fact, he doesn't even mention the race of any one of Floyd Patterson's opponents. He does not mention Floyd Patterson's race. That's 1961. In 1963, Martin Luther King in the famous March on Washington would make the stirring comment about, we're not interested in the color of your skin, but the content of your character. The Nation of Islam called the March on Washington the farce on Washington. They were turning this direction back, and it was a pretty dramatic change. Joyce Carol Oates plays right into it, the grandson of a slave. You ask yourself, is there no other, better, more interesting way to introduce him? How about his parents? Why talk about who his grandparents were? Why not his parents? He had a loving mother and a skilled muralist for a father who was a professional sign painter. Why not talk about his aunt, who was a math teacher, or his uncle, who was a mathematician, which may account for Ali's intuitive smarts? Why not talk about the fact that he was an oldest son and a two-child, ambitious, middle-class African-American family in Louisville, Kentucky? This is all thrown away because we're focusing on the grievance, the grandson of a slave. Why not talk about Ali's childhood compared to other childhoods of famous heavyweight champions? I'm just going to run through a few of them for you. Ali, remember, the first of two children, middle-class home. Jack Dempsey, 9th of 13, father, an itinerant drunk who took him all across the country. Joe Lewis, the 7th child of a sharecropper who was sent to an insane asylum at age 2. His mother married into a guy with 7 children of her own. The 14 of them, kids and 2 parents, moved to Detroit just in time for the Depression. Let's talk about some others. How about Floyd Patterson himself? Floyd Patterson shared his bed with more brothers than Ali had. He was one of, I think he was the 3rd of 11 children, dirt poor Brooklyn family, Coldwater Flats. He'd been arrested 30 times by the age of 10 and sent to reform school. That was Floyd Patterson's upbringing. Sonny Liston? Sonny Liston's makes the previous one sound like, Andy Hardy. He was the 22nd child of a vicious Arkansas sharecropper. Sonny Liston says, the only thing I ever got from my father was a whooping. He left home at 15 and for a life of almost primal thuggery until he was rescued by a Catholic priest in the Jefferson City prison. Rocky Marciano, the 2nd of 7 children. His father was an Italian immigrant who volunteered to fight in World War I, was gassed in the Argonne Forest and never recovered. He eked out a meager living in Brockton, Massachusetts shoe factory. None of these guys, Muhammad Ali graduated from high school. None of these guys even went to high school. I'm sorry, Marciano went 2 years. Even into the present times, when you look at guys like Joe Frazier, and this was the ones that hurts the most, and the one that's most telling, the 12th child of a South Carolina moonshiner, a one-armed moonshiner, living in Gullah country in South Carolina, which is the part of America closest in spirit to the African homeland. And he's younger than Ali. George Foreman, who's 7 years younger than Ali, the fifth of 7 children, a child of a Texas sharecropper who was out on the streets by the time he was 12. When he fought Ali in the rumble in the jungle in Zaire, they asked him, the news people asked him, they said, how do you feel about fighting at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning? And George Foreman answered without even kidding. He said, most of my fights have been at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. These were tough lives. I mean, Larry Holmes, 7th grade education, one of 12. Mike Tyson, and it's a tragic case there. He was on the streets at time at 12, just like Floyd Patterson, 30 or 40 arrests, sent to upstate home in New York State to find himself. These were hard childhoods, and yet of all their autobiographies, only one is a grievance narrative, and it's Muhammad Ali's. One other date, one other factor that Joyce Carol Oates might have talked about is the date he was born, January 17th, 1942. What was the world like in January 17th, 1942? This is 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor. How many children in January 7th, 1942, think about this, how many children who were born on January 7th, 1942 were born into a modern hospital, had their father pick them up in his own car, drive them home to a house with indoor plumbing, hot and cold running water, electricity, and no bombs falling through the roof? I'd say about 2 or 3 out of every 100 children in the world were born that blessed in the year 1942. Now let's face it, there are Ali's father and his family face all kinds of maddening indignities growing up in the border South pre-civil rights. But at the same time, there was a lot to be grateful for, and historically people were grateful for it. In the traditional grievance, in the traditional heroic narrative, when it deals with race, the racial awareness moment comes when the hero realizes that the other race is not bad, is not all evil, is good, potentially good. This goes both ways, black, white, it goes, Israeli, Palestinian, it goes, Belgian, French, it goes every possible way. Whenever 2 races come together. A classic case is Archie Moore. His book, and now Archie Moore knows a whole lot more about racism than Muhammad Ali ever did, fighting in Midwest and Southern tank towns in the 30s and 40s. His book is called Any Boy Can, right? His autobiography, Any Boy Can. And his moment of racial awareness comes when he and his manager, who's also black, have a car accident, terrible accident in Oklahoma on the side of the road. He's bleeding to death. A couple of young interns just happened by, white, with their dates. They take him into the car and drive him like 80 miles to the nearest hospital. And Archie Moore's saying, but I'm bleeding, I don't want to bleed all over your car. And they said, come on, don't be serious. And they take him. And at that moment, Archie Moore said, no, he goes, not all white people are bad. I can't think that way. There's good and bad in every race. That is the typical hero narrative. And the grievance narrative, it's just the opposite. In the grievance narrative, you learn that all races are kind of terrible. Oh, by the way, there's one other problem with Joyce Carol Oates calling Ali the grandson of a slave. And you know what that is? He's not the grandson of a slave. He's not. I mean, he's 77, he was born 77 years after the passage of the 13th Amendment. Of course he's not a grandson of a slave. But when you're doing a grievance narrative, things don't have to be true. You can embellish and you can make stuff up because typically the people who care aren't going to check. And in her case, why bother checking? Grandson of a slave just sounds so much better than great-grandson of a slave. And besides, some of his great-grandparents, at least 2 of them, were white. One of them came from Ireland, Abe Grady. I mean, he married his mother's grandmother, Dinah. This is after the end of the Civil War, and which is probably a pretty brave thing to do. Is not his parents, his aunts and uncles were equally proud of their white ancestors as they were their black ancestors, but not in a grievance narrative. That's all. Now it's all rape and defilement. Okay. In the grievance narrative, and in my book Hoodwinked, by the way, and if you're interested, it's Cashill.com, www.cashill.com, find that and others. I talk about a series of made-up and manufactured lives. Ward Churchill, the guy who passed as an Indian for his entire professional career, because no one bothered to checking. Edward Said, probably the most significant figure in the multicultural movement, the father of Orientalism, who passed himself off as a Palestinian refugee for his entire career, when in fact he was an American citizen, an Episcopalian, born in the lap of luxury in Cairo, and educated in American prep schools from the age of 12 on. Or Rigoberta Menchú, who was a Nobel Prize winner from Guatemala, who in her grievance narrative has her brother and 20 others, Indians being burned to death in a town square. An anthropologist stops behind the town square just innocently and says, hey, isn't this where Rigoberta Menchú's brother was burned to death with 20 other people? And some old guy says, no. And the anthropologist says, are you sure? And the guy says, in a small town, we'd remember if they burned 20 people to death in a town square. No, it never happened. The whole book was a fabrication. She still has her Nobel Prize. In the grievance narrative, you're allowed to make stuff up. So what happens to the young Ali? When does he begin to start making stuff up? When does his life become a grievance? Well, in 1960, when he became my hero, when he won the light heavyweight medal in the Olympics in Rome, he came back. A Russian journalist tried to provoke him in Rome about racial problems in America. And here's what Ali said. Tell your readers, and it's a wonderful sentence written in sort of perfect mid-continent Rotarian patois, it's tell your readers we got qualified people working on that problem, and I'm not worried about the outcome. That was Muhammad Ali in 1960. And what a wonderful statement that was, because it's pretty much true, at least to the degree that there could be an outcome, but the qualified people were working on it. Let's face it, some of them were paying with their lives and their heads, but they were working on it. He returns to Louisville after winning the Olympic gold. The whole town turns out for him, white and black. The mayor, they give him the keys to the city. His father, when he comes home, he paints the stairway red, white, and blue and sings the Star-Spangled Banner for the surrounding crowd. This is in 1960. He is the happiest kid alive. A group of wealthy white millionaires from Louisville get together and form a sponsoring group, and they give him the best and fairest starting contract any young boxer has ever had. And included in that is a $10,000 signing bonus, equivalent of about $70,000 today, and a brand new Cadillac. So here's Muhammad Ali in 1960. He's got a Cadillac, he's got sponsors, he's got 6,000 fans showing up at his first fight in Louisville as a 19-year-old. He's got loving parents, a middle-class home, great friends, and he's on the cutting edge of really breaking through racially in America. He's the coolest of our Cold War heroes for kids like myself. I was 12. What happens? Well, in the grievance narrative, you've got to create a scenario where something bad happens. Because it can't be just he changes his mind or he falls under the thrall of Elijah Muhammad. They've got to make something up. And the vehicle for making that up was a book called The Greatest, which was Muhammad Ali's autobiography, which came out in 1975. Excuse me a second. And has anyone read The Greatest or seen the movie that was made of that? At the time, it was a pretty popular book. It sold lots of copies. The movie was made, a regular Hollywood feature. It starred, in addition to Muhammad Ali playing himself, which is a little ludicrous, James Earl Jones, Robert Duvall, and a regular cast. George Benson sang the theme song, famous song. More famous than the movie, actually. Here's what happens in the movie and in the book. Let me start with the book. He comes back from Louisville. He comes back from the Olympics. He's in Louisville. It's Muhammad Ali. Shortly after he comes back, he goes to a diner with his friend Ronnie. They're on their motor scooters, and they ask to be served. The owner of the diner, even though he has his gold medal on, turns him down, uses as many vile racial slurs as he could possibly think of, as does all the patrons of the diner. The two of them leave the diner to be confronted by a motorcycle gang clad in swastikas and Confederate flags. The motorcycle gang chases them over to a bridge over the Ohio River, and a dozen or so of them attack Muhammad Ali and his friend, and somehow Muhammad Ali and his friend prevail, and they beat these guys up. Frog and Kentucky Slim were the two leaders of the motorcycle gang. They wimp off. Ali says then, this whole thing, this whole American dream, this whole gold medal, it's all a fraud, and he takes his gold medal and he drops it into the middle of the Ohio River. That's what the book says. In the movie version, it's a little toned down. Even though the movie was written, screenplay by Ring Lardner Jr., sort of unrepentant Stalinist of the Hollywood 10 stage. That was a little too much for him, so he tones it down to they get insulted in a restaurant, go off to the bridge, drop the gold medal into the middle of the Ohio River. Now, either one of these stories is true and one is not, but in fact, neither of them is true. This myth didn't materialize until several years later. The people who were around Ali early in those years testified that he wore the medal until it just, the gold came off. And he wore his USA boxing trunks in his first bout. This is all made up. Toni Morrison ghost wrote his autobiography. It's not every boxer as a Nobel Prize winner writing his autobiography. She may have thought it was true. It was being dictated by Herbert Muhammad, the book. It's the corruption, this literary corruption starts at the top. And we're worried about Jamie Fry? I mean, come on. Here's what the editor-in-chief of Random House says. The Random House published the book. By the way, the New York Times called the book honest and convincing. Editor-in-chief James Silberman, if you check Winston Churchill's version of history, you'd find it somewhat at odds with other versions by historians. So he compares it to Winston Churchill's books. What the book is, and why it's not just fraudulent, but destructively so, is that what it tells young people, young black people especially, is that life is going to be filled with racism. Even if you're the light heavyweight champion of the world, there's no hope for you. Now, in the book also, and in the movie they do this too, when Ali comes back after his exile in 1971 to fight Jerry Quarry in his first fight in Atlanta, he's out living in a house in a state senator's house outside of Atlanta, and a group of Ku Klux Klansmen or someone come and start shooting at them and trying to drive them away. Bundini, Ali's faithful friend, comes out shooting and scares them away. None of this ever happened. This is all made up. But what they're reinforcing is the Nation of Islam message at this time that nothing's changed. Even now, in 1971, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and even after Ali has established himself as a national hero, nothing's changed. The grievances continue to fester. Here's what historian Thomas Aitala says about the motorcycle gang fight on the bridge, right? Totally bizarre and fabricated. While inaccurate in detail, the story was metaphorically true. No, it was metaphorically false, and it was false in detail. Everything about it was false. It was false, and it was destructively false, but that's the way the grievance narrative works. What really happened to Ali? What really happened is unfortunate, and it's sort of prosaic, but he went to Miami because he never worked a job in his life. His management team first sent him out to work with Archie Moore. In California, Archie Moore's place was called the Salt Mine. He made people work in addition to actually boxing. Ali wanted none of it, so they sent him down to Miami to train with Angelo Dundee, and Dundee just said, hey, you just do your thing in the ring. Whatever you do outside is you're doing outside. He's 18 years old. Ferdy Pacheco, who is the ring doctor, says he was a ship adrift, rudderless, without a captain. But now, listening to the wisdom of the old man, Ali saw the way. The old man was Elijah Muhammad. He fell under the sway of the Nation of Islam when I was alone and adrift in Miami as an 18, 19-year-old. And they worked very hard on him. They surrounded him 24/7. And there was one other tragedy in Ali's life that was not well known at the time, and that made him particularly vulnerable to the Nation of Islam. He was illiterate. He couldn't read. Despite the fact that he graduated from high school because he was a teacher's pet. They loved him. He also, by the way, graduated from high school a virgin, and he fainted on his first kiss. He had an Andy Hardy childhood. But alone in the drift in Miami, unable to read beyond the headline and barely that, all the information in 1961, too, is coming to you through print, or else people are telling you stuff. And the Nation of Islam just filled his head with stuff, 24/7 stuff. And it wasn't just a temporary situation. And this is a very difficult part of his life. When he joins the Nation of Islam formally in 1964, and do you know what name they give him? He's Cassius Clay. Then joins the Nation of Islam. Next day they announce his joining. You know what name they give him? Trivia question? Anyone? It's Cassius X. A quick trivia question. He's Cassius X for about a month, and he becomes Muhammad Ali. When Cassius Clay joined the black Muslims, he became a champion of racial segregation, and that is what we are fighting against. You know who says that? Martin Luther King. This is 1964. You know, the one senator in Washington who went onto the floor of the Senate to defend Ali's choice to join the Nation of Islam. I'm going to read what he says. Cassius Clay, in common with 180 million other American citizens, has the right to join the religious sect of his choice without being blackmailed, harassed, and threatened. That was the arch-segregationist Georgia Senator Richard Russell, the one who came to Ali's defense. This is what it was like in 1964 when he joined. And this was not just a temporary aberration. When he was interviewed by Playboy as late as 1975, this is the year that Elijah Muhammad died and Ali begins to regain himself, he's asked by the interviewer if he thought lynching was the answer to interracial sex, whether interracial couples should be lynched. He answered, a black man should be killed if he's messing with a white woman. It's 1975. He also said that in reverse, with white men, black women. At the same interview, he said, America don't have no future. America's going to be destroyed. In 1978, he was asked about equality for females. He said, someone's got to wear the pants and someone's got to wear the dress. There isn't going to be any equality. It was 1978. Now, in the grievance narrative, when there's information you don't like, you suppress it, and that's essentially what they did here. There are certain things, though, that were very difficult to suppress. One thing was the relationship with Malcolm X, and this was very troubling. And this is a story that most boxing writers know about, they just don't want to talk about. Malcolm X had nurtured the young Ali through his early period, and he took a particular interest in him. Elijah Muhammad was backing off a little bit because they thought he was going to lose to Sonny Liston. And when he did not, as soon as he won the fight against Sonny Liston, the first fight against Sonny Liston, Elijah Muhammad called him and said, listen, I'm going to make you a member of the Nation of Islam. I'm going to give you the name Muhammad Ali, an Arabic name, something Malcolm X doesn't even have, if you do one thing. And that is you have to sever your relationship with Malcolm X. And that's what he did. So he dropped Malcolm X cold, even though Malcolm X was the only one at ringside that night, the only one who had stayed with him. And it gets worse. Immediately after that, the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, put a fatwa on Malcolm X's head. They went out to kill him. Not only him, but Leon 4X Amir, who was Malcolm X's, who was loyal to Malcolm X. Within a year, both of them would be dead. About a few weeks before Malcolm X was murdered in the Audubon Ballroom in 1965, February 21st, his wife came to Ali. She found him in Harlem at the Teresa Hotel and said, you see what you're doing to my husband, don't you? And he raised his hands in his air and said, I'm not doing anything to him. Now, that's what the average 22 or 23-year-old might do. I mean, he's scared to death, and he has reason to be scared to death. I don't have anything to do with him. But the hero of children's books, we expect more of. And that's part of the tragedy of this whole story. How did this come to be? And then to answer the question, the grievance narrative is the general topic that made the story worth telling. The specific thing to Ali, and this is the amazing thing, the thing that caused the media to embrace him, by 65, 66, 67, he was getting booed at every fight. He got booed at the second Sonny Liston fight, and Sonny Liston was the least popular champ of all time. What is it that caused America to embrace Muhammad Ali? At this period, and it's an amazing kind of answer. He dodged the draft. This is a really astonishing thing when you go back into it and say, how did dodging the draft make him a hero? Here's what happened. In 1967, there was a changing of the guard in America's newsroom just about to take place. And the young writers saw in Ali, to this point their movement had been lily white, they were embarrassed by that. They were being accused of being cowardly and yellow and weak and not having courage. And then all of a sudden they saw in Muhammad Ali their best selves. They began to celebrate not so much Muhammad Ali, but themselves. And that is essentially how they began to change the image of Ali. When the older writers retired, the newer guys, especially the new guys in broadcasting and in TV, began to change and take Ali with them. By the time Ali comes back in 1971, he's a hero. And it's astonishing to watch this take place. And there's no really other reason for it, because on the racial front, he hadn't changed. But to the people who were celebrating themselves, their newly, splendidly liberated selves, they really didn't care about race. They really cared about their own image as portrayed in Muhammad Ali. And then all of a sudden it was a celebration. Okay, he's in favor of lynching interracial couples, African homeland in America. America's a terrible place. It wasn't that an issue anymore. So, and then what happens after that, most of that story, and I'm going to leave a lot of that to you to follow in the book. But when he comes back, he runs into a series of situations that cause him to position himself against white America. And he makes the unwitting representative of white America none other than Joe Frazier, the 12th child of a South Carolina moonshiner and from Gullah country who left home at 15 by himself on a Greyhound, worked in a meatpacking plant, became the model for Sylvester Stallone's Rocky in many ways, and then found himself in 1971 as a white man. And the media turned not only against Joe Frazier, but they turned against everyone who rooted for Joe Frazier. Jerry Eisenberger, a famous sports writer, would say 25 years later, today you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody, the guy who would have to be a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi, who doesn't feel that Ali's stand on Vietnam was understandable and basically justified. Or another writer in 1999, a British writer, the people who wanted Frazier to beat Ali, this is Mike Marksey, were the die-hard racists, the love it or leave it brigade, the people who resented everything Ali stood for. So in 1971, weeks before the Frazier-Ali fight, the media give that part of white America its own hero in Archie Bunker. 10 years earlier had been Ralph Cramden. That's what it changed. They had polarized and divided, and they used Ali as a pawn in the polarization and division. It didn't get better. In the second half of the book, I talk about the consequences of the myth and what happens to it. And I'll leave that to you to find out. But just like in the first part, rather than just telling a story about heroes and myths, the world of boxing is so filled with great and powerful stories that I'd rather tell it through the stories. And in the second half, I tell it through the person of Mike Tyson, which is really one of the most tragic and unfortunate and unnecessary stories in our time. It didn't have to happen what happened to him. And it was, in a sense, very much the result of what happened with Ali in the 60s and 70s, the whole racialization of boxing, the creation of Don King, and the exploitation of everyone who got in Don King's way. And with that, I think I'm going to tell just one last thing, an example of a story we should be telling to school children, and then I'll turn it over to questions. Here's the story I would tell. If I were to pick one story to talk about in the last 50 years of heavyweight boxing, I would tell the extraordinary story of George Foreman. Think about this story. Here's a guy, he's the fifth of 7 children. His father isn't really his father. He hates him from the beginning, battered, beaten, abused, out on the streets. He's saved by an unusual combination of a loving mother and the Job Corps, the first success story the Job Corps ever had. In 1968, when the black fist in the air is the popular thing, he goes into the ring and waves a small American flag and endeared himself at that time to a good chunk of America. He still was seriously adrift for the next bunch of years. He was surly and sullen and self-absorbed and just not himself, not who he would become. He gets beat by Ali in the Rumble of the Jungle. A year later, he has a genuine come-to-Jesus moment. A virtual out-of-body come-to-Jesus moment. And then instead of just talking about helping people and just talking about doing good, he quits at the peak of his career. He's 28 years old and becomes a street corner preacher in Houston. And then people begin to take him seriously because he's good at it. And then he realizes to reach youth, he has to start a community center. So he takes all of his money and he opens a community center with his brother in Houston. And he's reaching youth, and then he realizes he's running out of money. So he says, what am I going to do? Well, I'll go back and make one more stab at the heavyweight championship. At the age of 45, he fights Michael Moorer. And if you believe in, if you don't believe in God, this is luck. If you believe in God, this is God. He loses the first 9 rounds. And then in the 10th round, he finds himself, and he knocks, Moorer out like Moorer hits the canvas like a sack of oats. He's gone. Foreman gets down on his knees and prays. Well, he was praying pretty hard because right after that, the Salton Company approaches George Foreman with the single most inspired idea in sports marketing history, the George Foreman Grill. He sells, how many George Foreman grills were sold? 70 million George Foreman grills. After several years, the Sultan company says, this is costing us too much money. Let's buy Foreman out. You know how much they had to pay to buy him out? $137 million. That brings his total to $250 million, which he pours back into his youth center, right? Now, this is a story that kids should be told. It works on every level. But this is not the story they're being told. And what I'm here for tonight is just to try to inject back into the American narrative stories that are ennobling and inspiring, and they're powerful and they're positive, rather than asking people to nurse their grievances for the rest of the 21st century. The people who tell those stories, obviously, is one reason they don't tell them, because none of them have a George Foreman lean, mean, fat grilling machine. Thank you. Why don't we take some questions here? Yes, sir.
Do I need to talk to the mic or
Stand up, yeah, sure.
how much of the Joe Frazier stuff with Ali was real animosity and how much of it was Barnum and Bailey?
Joe Frazier thinks it was all real animosity because in both in the first fight, in 1971, the fight of the century, they already had their guarantees in the bank. They each got $2.5 million for it, and that was guaranteed. Frazier never forgave Ali. Frazier's the one person who is, he's gotten better in the last few years, but if you read his 1996 autobiography, he's angry because in 71 he portrays him as a white man. By the time they get to the third fight in Manila, the thrill in Manila, he's portraying him as a guerrilla. And that just it hurt him. I mean, even in his hometown of Philadelphia, Frazier became a pariah, and it was difficult. So part of it was shtick, though. It just got out of hand. It just got ugly. Any other questions or comments? Yes, back here.
I'm curious how you came to the idea of talking about heroes. What's kind of inspiring you writing this book?
It was actually meeting two-ton Toni Galento. I don't know. I mean, if you grew up as a sports fan, and part of it, the book is semi-autobiographical, and I didn't get into this too much, but I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, which was a city in full collapse in the mid-'60s. And there's a famous story, and it may be true, where there's a black man on death row in the 30s. And just as they're ready to pull the switch, he yells out, "Save me, Joe Louis, save me," right? And it's really poignant and kind of sad, but in mid-'60s Newark, when I was a kid, and Ali was, and Cassius Clay / Muhammad Ali was out there, we almost saw him as the person like, "Save us, Cassius Clay, save us." I mean, who's a person who transcended race? And in his dealings with people, he has always been great. And I don't mean to run him down entirely, because he's charismatic and he was bigger than life. And all of my friends, we listened to that first Sonny Liston fight on the radio as our lives depended on it. We were afraid he was going to get killed. And I stuck with him all the way through 67, all the way until he went off into the draft. It was getting harder and harder because there was a lot more I had to not see and not hear. But I think when you're a kid especially in a troubled time and place, heroes are very important. And that was part of what my motivation was. Yes, sir.
What inspired Ali to look into and explore politics, and consequently, did the Republicans exploit his interest?
Yes, the Republicans exploited his interest. In fact, it's funny when you read Thomas Hauser's book, and it's the authorized biography, and it's very comprehensive. And when he reaches the part where Ali shows up in the Republican National Convention, he prefaces it by saying, "And then another problem arose," right? And then he interviews people like Julian Bond and whatnot, and they're all horrified, But they pushed this one to bed very quickly. Ali, this was a problem in a sense with his being illiterate, is that he was very subject to manipulation by people, including Orrin Hatch, frankly. And there was some lawyer who was pulling his strings at the time. I don't know that he was a sincere Republican. I mean, he could have been, in the sense that by 1984 he didn't drink, dance, or run around. And he was a very God-fearing person. He could have been a member of the moral majority, for all I know, but it doesn't seem like it was a genuine commitment to Republican politics. Nor was it genuine before that. Again, he was being led by Elijah Muhammad. Yes?
What do you admire most about it?
What do I admire most? I would say what I admire most is his how gracefully he's borne the burden he's had to bear. I mean, he's done that, I think, very well and very admirably. He doesn't have Parkinson's disease, by the way. He has what's called pugilistic Parkinson's, which is he's been hit too many times. And in a sense, he became the victim of his own myth, because the mythologizer said, fight once more, you're doing it for the people, you know, you're peace, justice, love, Vietnam, blah, blah, blah. And he fought about 6 years longer than he should have. But knowing that, and he knows that, you don't see him complain. You don't see him, gripe about it. He's gone back to the sort of sweet, innocent kid he once was in Louisville. Yeah, so as far as I could tell, anyhow, it seems pretty sincere. Yes, sir.
You talk about the apotheosis by the journalistic left of Muhammad Ali, and it took a willful suspension of disbelief because as late as 1968 and 1969, he appeared at the joint press conference with a member of the Ku Klux Klan, the two of them there to denounce the mixing of the races.
Yeah, you're right. It took a lot of overlooking stuff. In fact, the Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam was always comfortable with the Ku Klux Klan, just like Marcus Garvey was, 50 years earlier. You want to go back to Africa? Sure, that's fine with us. The thing they don't talk about here, for instance, is that when he first came back from his exile, do you know which governor finally gave him permission to fight? It's Lester Maddox in Georgia. So the Nation of Islam had a very cozy relationship, and Shelby Steele talks about this very knowledgeably. He's a black social theorist, author of Content of Our Character and other books, but he talks about it as creating a zone of decency. So if you're a white reporter, you put yourself in a zone of decency and you put other white people outside of it. So Joyce Carol Oates, for instance, and other authors, several of them, are constantly referring to white America. And so Joyce Carol Oates says, how shabbily white America treated Muhammad Ali. As though what? She's not white? As though she's someone else or someone different? They do that all the time. And so, and this kind of what Shelby Steele calls redemptive liberalism, as opposed to real civil rights liberalism, where you get your heads banged in, you don't care about race other than to make yourself feel good. And so who cares what happens to Mike Tyson? As long as I feel good about it, And that's what it comes down to, alas. I think we have time for about one more question, yes.
In these days of, especially in religious tensions, especially what we're dealing with right now, and racial relations as well, how well do you see this book being perceived in the community, especially in America, but even around the world?
I hope that my hope is that it will be perceived and that it will generate some discussion. And it's not an easy book. I mean, if someone came to Kansas City and wrote a book about George Brett having a creepy period, I'd probably be sitting, I don't want to hear this, get out of here. But then George Brett never presented himself to the world as the greatest, or as the liberator of the world, or as the Henry Kissinger, like Muhammad Ali did. Jimmy Carter never sent George Brett on a mission to Africa to represent America. I think we have to overcome that instinctive reluctance to hear the truth. And what I've heard so far from people, not everyone likes what I've said. I was on a show in Philadelphia the other day where they had on Muhammad Ali's daughter, one of his daughters, and that was not, I don't argue with people's daughters. And I don't blame her for defending her father, and I didn't mean to be attacking him formally, but until we begin to look at this subject honestly, and no one has yet said to me, this isn't true. A few boxing writers said, oh, everyone knows all this. Well, everyone may know it, well, why don't you share it? I mean, all boxing writers may know this, and they did. They just didn't share it. And that's the problem, is we've got to get beyond closing ourselves off to contrary information. And I think if we do that, we can begin to make some progress. But for the last 40 years, we've skidded sideways because it's so hard to have an honest conversation. But I think we have time for one or two more questions. So if anyone else wants to raise their hand? Yes, sir.
I was fascinated by your comment about the Floyd Patterson book and,
Yes.
and no mention of black or white race whatsoever.
Right.
Comment, please, on the possible negative ramifications of the civil rights movement in that we now seem to always talk about and perceive with regards to race, whereas the Floyd Patterson book might be that we just didn't even bother to think in those terms.
Well, we did. It's just that the movement up until that time, and this was the early civil rights movement, the movement was away from racial consciousness. And I think that climaxed in '63 with Martin Luther King's speech, and in '64 with the Civil Rights Bill, '65 with the Voting Rights Act. What happened after that is, I think, is that the civil rights movement was hijacked by people who were more interested in self-aggrandizement than in actual civil rights. And that's why we've skidded sideways. And the classic case of this is what happens with Mike Tyson and Don King. And just quickly, Tyson grows up with this extraordinarily feral childhood in the streets of Brooklyn. Probably the most difficult childhood in America at that time. He's sent to a boys' home in upstate New York. There, he's discovered at a 13-year-old by Customato, who also had discovered Floyd Patterson. And Customato sees him as a 13-year-old, and he says to him, if you want to be, you're going to be the heavyweight champion of the world. And he takes him as a 14-year-old, he and the woman he's living with, and this big, happy boxing family in Catskill, New York, they literally adopt him. They bring him home. And Tyson's never had any family or parents or anything, he calls these people his parents. Joyce Carol Oates, writing about him when he's 18 years old, says, this is the first boxer who has the chance to transcend race. This is what Joyce Carol Oates says. All of his fans were white. And when you go back and read about the young Mike Tyson, it's hard to believe how much hope and promise there was in this young guy. He was, like Floyd Patterson, he was just a borderline personality because his life had been so difficult. Customato dies, Don King swoops in. And to get him away from his management team, he starts preying on them racially. You don't want to work with these Jews in suits, do you? No, come with me, support the black man, blah, 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 blah. And just sort of steals him away. And then just leads him downhill so quick and so fast, Mike Tyson didn't know what happened to him. And he ends up in Japan fighting Buster Douglas, totally unprepared, and loses 42-1 shot. And then from there on in, it's downhill, downhill, downhill. And it didn't have to happen. And it was largely a result of Don King's exploitation. Don King is, by the way, he showed up at the 2004 Republican convention also. Don King's exploitation of race. I mean, Don King exploits everything. Patriotism, whatever, it doesn't matter. But it became something to exploit rather than something to feel and live. And that's, I think, the larger problem. I think we're going to take one quick last question and wrap up. Yes, sir.
Me?
Yes.